Hello, a very warm welcome to the second edition of our webinar series on expanding the frontier of economics, evidence from South Asia. Under this project, we wish to host special sessions on emerging areas of research in economics by bringing together research from domains of sociology, psychology, anthropology, and political science, apart from just economics. We wish to bring together a new generation of researchers who are rediscovering the principles which govern the actions, interactions among us, the socio-economic beings. We wish to challenge the existing mainstream theories and bring forward a more pluralistic approach to addressing the issues facing our societies, our region. Today's session is on the social cost of price of land, and this is being hosted by the South Asia Working Group in collaboration with the Urban and Regional Economics Working Group of the South of the Young Scholars Initiative. I take this opportunity to firstly thank Satvik from the South Asia Working Group for taking lead in organizing this session, and Simone for bringing the Urban and Regional Working Group into this session. Over to you, Satvik, for introductions.
Thank you. Good evening to all of you. Today, we are very excited to have Dr. Sai Balakrishnan, Assistant Professor of Global Urban Inequalities at the University of California, Berkeley. She would be discussing about the social cost of the price of the land. Her recent book is titled Shareholder Cities, Land Transformations Along Urban Corridors in India. It's published by University of Pennsylvania Press. And she has kindly agreed to share a PDF copy of our book at the end of the session. Thank you, Dr. Balakrishnan, for this. And now Simone will introduce our discussion.
Well, it's a pleasure to have as a discussant today Professor Benjamin Davy, or as we will for now on call him, Ben. So welcome, Ben. We're really happy to have you here. And he's a professor of land policy, land management, and geoinformation at the Technical University in Dortmund. And currently is a visiting professor, a virtual visiting professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, as well as at the School of Architecture and Spatial Planning at the Technical University in Vienna. Now he has published extensively on a variety of topics spanning planning theory and law, land management, and currently is working on projects regarding human dignity and land reform, especially in the context of South Africa, and also on the issue of of land use ethics. So welcome, and we're looking forward to having you as a discussant here. And now I would like to give the floor to Sai. It's all yours, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much to Satvik, Anisha, Simone. I'm really delighted to have a chance to share my work with you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the screen.
Perfect.
And thank you so much to Ben for agreeing to be a discussant. We've already started a very lively email conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to continuing it over Zoom. So this talk will focus on India's agrarian urban transformation and the associated land conflicts and land revaluations, right, that go with this transformation. And I'll start with what I call India's land puzzle as a way of giving you some context to the economic geography of India's land conflicts. And then I'll connect this puzzle to the two key analytics of this talk, to social cost and to the price of land. And I'll end with a case study and the surprises that you encounter when you do field research. And I'll focus on the CADE SEZ in Western Maharashtra, in Western India. So I'll start with India's land puzzle. Now in 2001, the Indian government launched one of the most ambitious infrastructure development programs that the country has ever seen, comparable in scale only to the massive railway building enterprise of colonial India. And that's the building of these new economic corridors. Now, these economic corridors are expected to be the spines along which globally competitive private cities or urban enclaves, such as SEZ, special economic zones, container ports, and other logistics hubs will develop. And the signature and very, very well-known economic corridor is the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, DMIC. Now, these new urban corridors cut across agricultural land. They blaze through agricultural land. And the making of these corridor regions entails a great transformation in land. Now, agricultural land in India is one of the most protected commodities. And the past 2 decades have witnessed a massive rehauling of India's land laws to transform agricultural land from a protected commodity to an urban fungible asset. And these land transformations are fraught with conflict. So those of you who have been following the news in India know that the past 15 years or so are referred to as the decades of land wars, right? Because we've seen some of the most violent and volatile land conflicts in post-colonial India. Now, India's land conflicts are often portrayed, particularly in liberal Western narratives, as urban versus rural clashes. So here, the urban stands in for modern westernized India and the rural for the traditional superstitious India. So for instance, these are images from the National Geographic where you see images of the new urban corridors juxtaposed with images of traditional women in saris, lazy bullocks, holy men on elephants, right? And this is the conventional narrative that these economic corridors are transforming a traditional superstitious rural society into an urban modern society. And as with any modernizing process, this social transformation, it's argued, is fraught with dislocations and conflicts. So these images and these narratives, in fact, rehearse very, very popular older modernization tropes, which were popularized by Rostow and others. And here's the puzzle that I want to start this talk with. Contrary to these popular representations, contrary to these conventional narratives, if we map the most contentious land conflicts of the past decade in India, we realize that the new urban corridors are not anachronistic or oppositional to the agrarian countryside. Instead, these urban corridors are clustering onto former Green Revolution regions. So the Green Revolution, as many of you know, was a massive agricultural modernization program pushed through by the United States in the context of the Cold War to avert any turn to communism. India has its own history of the Green Revolution coming out of famines and food scarcity in the 1960s. Now, the Green Revolution created huge regional divides, and Barbara Harris White, various other agrarian scholars have written extensively about this. Now, you can see in this map that the Green Revolution regions, right, which I've marked here in green, are largely concentrated in the arc that stretches from the northwest to the southeast of the country. And it's precisely onto these Green Revolution regions that the new urban corridors are settling and accreting, right? So for instance, the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor is settling onto a very prosperous Green Revolution region, the country's first economic corridor, the Mumbai-Pune Expressway, which was the focus of my book. And this corridor became the blueprint for the national economic corridor policy, is again at the epicenter of a Green Revolution region. Now, these Green Revolution regions are occupied by some of the most powerful and organized agrarian propertied classes. So to reiterate, what we have here is not some modernization trope of urban versus rural, traditional versus modern, right? But we are witnessing a clash between agrarian and urban elites over who gets to capture the surpluses from the ongoing urbanization of the agrarian countryside. Now, the context for India's urban corridors is the 1991 economic liberalization reforms. And India's economic liberalization is part of a wider wave of economic transitions in former communist and socialist countries that started in the euphemistic words of market ideologues. They started quote unquote, opening up their markets after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, these urban corridors have been justified by policymakers as necessary infrastructural programs to kickstart market-oriented urbanization. So a policymaker in India, in Delhi, for instance, famously quipped that India has the engine of a bullock cart and the brakes of a Rolls Royce, right? Which means that older pre-liberalization policies had so many state regulations, so many brakes, that India's economic growth could be compared to that of a bullock cart. And the new land policies, such as the economic corridor policy, the associated SEZ policy, all of these are attempts to rapidly create efficient cities. And in line with the norms of efficiency, these cities are governed like companies, like corporations, right? So for instance, if you look at the governance structures of SEZs, they mimic corporate governance. Now, just like firms, just like corporations, these new private cities along urban corridors outsource most of their costs onto communities and onto publics. So the term social cost comes out of welfare economics. It means externalities, costs that are unpaid for by the corporation and that are outsourced onto publics. And in urban planning, social cost was popularized by Ronald Coase in his very influential 1960 article, The Problem of Social Cost. So a very simple example is the $2 hamburger that Raj Patel writes about in his book, The Value of Nothing. So the Big Mac hamburger is $2 because McDonald's does not internalize the full cost of its production. If the cost of its carbon footprint, for instance, were internalized, then the burger would cost $200 or even more, right? Given all of these contestations over how do you even assign a market value to environmental harms. Similarly, India's new private cities that are coming up along the urban corridors also have huge social costs, huge externalities that they outsource onto publics. For instance, these private cities rely extensively on public water. They rely on groundwater and water from public rivers that are diverted to these cities through large disruptive big dam projects. They rely on the exploited labor of urban informal workers, where even the cost of social reproduction of these workers is not covered by urban wages, right? And in India, we saw this brutal labor exploitation last year during the COVID lockdown and the migrant crisis, where urban informal workers started this mass exodus on foot back to their home villages because it's the village, it's a subsistence plot of land in their village that's their safety net during a crisis. These private cities need sand for their construction, and there's been a rise of violent, unregulated sand mafias. These private cities also massively rely on the enclosure of common lands during their construction, common lands or quote unquote wastelands. So land with various forms of communal tenure are enclosed, privatized, and they're converted into these new private cities. So in short, for all this talk about India's grand new experiment of private cities, of financing these cities through private capital, there is a huge reliance and a huge exploitation of public resources for the making of these cities. And the fundamental question, as always, is who bears the social cost of private cities, right? As with any other society and any other large-scale social transformation, these social costs are imposed on the most vulnerable groups in India. And in this talk, I'll focus on the common lands or the quote-unquote wastelands that are largely occupied by subaltern castes, by indigenous groups, by women, and these are the lands that are being enclosed and privatized. And here I want to return to this early framing that I started this talk with. Right? Agrarian elites have considerable power to negotiate with powerful urban firms, incoming firms in these corridor regions. But the casualty in these processes of corridor urbanization are marginal farmers, landless laborers, women. And it's these vulnerable agrarian groups that also migrate in distress to work seasonally in the private cities as urban informal workers. Right? So if we frame India's land conflicts as urban versus rural, we completely miss out on the very unequal caste and class structures in these urbanizing villages, and the ways in which these relations of power and exploitation cut across agrarian spaces, agrarian and urban spaces and economies, right? So in short, the social cost of private cities is violently imposed on the most vulnerable social groups whose lives and livelihoods necessarily straddle agrarian and urban economies and spaces, right? Which brings me now to the next analytic on the price of land. Now, this reframing of India's land conflicts, not as urban versus rural, is also important because social costs are not new to post-liberalization India. The Green Revolution, in fact, had huge social costs, right? It was an extremely water extractive program, and it led to huge groundwater depletion, big dam projects that flooded and dispossessed millions of vulnerable citizens. And that, again, that's why this understanding of India's land conflicts, not as urban versus rural, but as one where the new social costs of the urban corridors are colluding and even recombining with older agrarian era social costs is very important to understand. And one of the most important recombinations of these agrarian urban social costs that I'll talk about is the revaluation of common lands or wastelands. But before I get to move on to the India case, I wanted to briefly connect this crucial land category of quote unquote wasteland to broader theories and debates on land price and land markets. Now, much of the scholarship on urban land markets comes from the experiences of Western cities. And I'd like to spend a bit of time here to think about how these Western land theories speak to India's land transformation. And an instructive place to start is the field of economic geography, and within economic geography, the very influential location theory. So location theory is fundamentally concerned with the question of how land use and land price or land rent shapes the very structure of cities and urbanization, right? So for those of us who are interested in space and power, location theory deals with the social organization of space. Location theory is a staple of urban planning. So any urban planner would be familiar with sector theory, though Ben, of course, disagrees with this. But I hope many of my urban planning students would be familiar with sector theory, bid rent theories, with hedonic pricing. And location theory is also central to the new economic geography that's been popularized by the Nobel Prize winning work of Paul Krugman, amongst others. Now, a very influential precursor to the field of economic geography and location theory is Fontunen's isolated state model. So Fontunen was a farmer and political economist writing in the context of 19th century Prussia. And this is the well-known Fontunen model. And Fontunen was intrigued by a question. Despite the fact that the farmers in Prussia did not know each other, and there was no regional coordinating planning agency in Prussia at the time, yet the pattern of land uses was strikingly similar across Prussia. Right? This is how land uses organized themselves around the central city or the central marketplace. And Fontunen's explanation for this was that this was the working of the invisible hand of the market, right? So remember, this is before the time of refrigeration. So the farmers who grow perishable commodities, for instance, those who are engaged in dairy, orchard, market gardens, they have to make sure that their commodities reach the market, reach the central city as fast as possible before these commodities perish, right? Before they spoil. And so these farmers will bid more for the land that's closest to the central city, to the market center. These farmers of perishable commodities will outbid the farmers who are engaged in livestock rearing, in trapping, hunting, because these other commodities like lumber can take more time to reach the market without any threat of them getting spoiled or their profits getting affected. Now, the key argument here is that the price system can allocate land uses most efficiently. Even though farmers are complete strangers to one another, they will smoothly bid themselves into these land use patterns where the combination of the price of land and transportation costs will shape the structure of agrarian and urban land uses. Now, I want you to just notice this category of wilderness, right, in the Fontunen model. Now, in India, this model breaks down. The agrarian-urban edge is not a neat, clean line, but instead what we have in India is a vast contested frontier of private cities which are located right amidst prosperous green revolution regions. But most importantly, the Fontunen model has some very important ideological insights on wasteland, quote unquote wasteland. A key unstated assumption of the Fontunen model is that of private property rights. Farmers as consumers can bid for land around the central city if private property rights is the dominant mode of organizing land. Any spatial expansion, any new transportation network, any new agrarian or urban settlement is possible only because of the presence of what Fontunen marks as wilderness in his model. Now, of course, with revisionist histories, we know that what Fontunen marked as quote unquote wilderness was not some unoccupied frontier. In settler colonies like the United States, for instance, and this has been brilliantly showed by the work of William Cronin, amongst others, these frontier lands were occupied by Native Americans with their own property regimes. And the land category of wilderness was an ideology of conquest that made it possible for the colonial occupation of another people's lands. In colonial South Asia, this quote unquote frontier was the new land revenue regimes instigated by the Lockean view of property and improvement. For the British colonial state, wasteland meant revenue waste. And in a bid to transform this wild wasteland to revenue generating agricultural land, because agricultural taxes were one of the main sources of revenue for the colonial state, the late colonial state invested in massive irrigation canals. And it's these irrigation canals that became the basis for land categories that we continue to use in India today. Irrigated land was classified as fertile land, and unirrigated land became quote unquote wasteland, right? So reiterating here that waste has an economic logic, waste meant revenue waste. And it's this category of wasteland that's now being revalued in contemporary India. Okay? So let me just move on to the case study, just so I can bring some of these various threads together. But also, most importantly, field research is very illuminating because you're constantly encountering unexpected surprises, right? Unexpected findings. And they can really help you theorize from the ground up. So I do have a methodological bias for case studies. And the case study that I'd like to focus on is the CADE SEZ. So to give you a context on the location of the CADE SEZ, this SEZ is located in the state of Maharashtra. And you can see in this zoomed in image that it's proximate to the Mumbai-Pune Expressway, right? The country's first economic corridor. So its locational advantage derives from its proximity to this new economic corridor. Now, this entire region, particularly the Pune region, was the epicenter of the Green Revolution for the state of Maharashtra, right? So here again, you have this territorial overlap between the new SEZ and the former Green Revolution region. Now, the CADE SEZ, as you can see in this image, it's located in a topography with undulating terrain. So in this image, you can see that the plains in the front of the image are very verdant, are very fertile. right? There's a dense network of irrigation canals here. These irrigated plains mainly grow cabbage and other vegetables, which are sold to large cities, including to Pune. Now, in the background, you can see these low brown hillocks, right? And these are the hillocks which are unirrigated with quote unquote wasteland, right? And now this is very important because these land categories of fertile and wasteland map onto social power. Through long agrarian histories of socio-spatial segregation, dominant caste landowners appropriated the irrigated land on the plains, and the wasteland on the hillocks was relegated to subaltern caste groups, the indigenous groups called Adivasis. And these indigenous groups mainly grow subsistence crops on their hillock wastelands, but for their livelihood, they mainly work as agricultural laborers for the more powerful agrarian elites in the plains, right? So you can see how land ownership maps quite neatly onto social power. So fertility, of course, is socially constructed, right? Socio-technically constructed. That's my point here. Now, in 2006, the Indian firm Bharat Forge proposed the setting up of a new multi-purpose SEZ, Special Economic Zone, in the Khed area. And the revenue department, so the revenue department is a land bureaucracy that was set up during the colonial period, and it continues to be a very, very powerful land bureaucracy even today. So the revenue department bureaucrats forcibly acquired through the exercise of eminent domain, or what in India is called land acquisition, the irrigated land on the plains in 4 Khed villages. Now, this forced acquisition of their lands provoked a huge backlash from the agrarian elites who own these irrigated lands. Now, alienating an organized agrarian constituency in India means inviting trouble at the ballot box, right? Because they're a formidable electoral constituency. And so the revenue department bureaucrats started a 2-year negotiation with the protesting dominant caste agrarian landowners to come up with an amicable solution. And the solution that they came up with was this. The boundaries of the SEZ were redrawn to remove all of the irrigated land on the plains, and the SEZ now enclosed only the unirrigated wasteland on the hillocks. Also, some of the most volatile land conflicts in India today are over the compensation price for land, right? So there's a huge clash between the state and agrarian elites on what constitutes the fair market value of compensation for land. Now, in order to sidestep this question, the revenue department bureaucrats very, very cleverly innovated with a unique arrangement. Rather than deciding on the compensation price ex ante, they offered the landowners a non-monetary compensation in the form of 15% shares in the new SEZ company. And these 15% shares would be distributed pro rata in proportion to the land given up for the SEZ to these agrarian landowners. So in effect, agrarian landowners became shareholders, right? And for anyone who's interested, this is a variation on a very, very popular mode of land assembly called land readjustment, which is gaining a lot of popularity, not just in India, but in many parts of the global south. The new capital city of Amravati in Telangana, for instance, uses land readjustment. So let's just take a look at this SEZ map, right? And the enclosure of these wastelands. Now you see here, the SEZ boundary is marked in orange, and you see that the SEZ now only encloses the wasteland on the hillocks, right? All of the fertile lands are left out. Also, you see in this table and also on the map that around 25% of these wastelands are government owned. Right? The remaining 75% are privately owned. Of these privately owned wastelands, around 2/3 are owned by indigenous groups and the remaining by agrarian elites. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time, around 5 minutes, and then I'll wrap up, to look at the effects of this land enclosure on the various social groups. The revenue department bureaucrats, for instance, selected this cluster of villages, this very specific cluster of 4 villages, because of the presence of a sizable acreage of government-owned common land or quote-unquote wasteland. And these government-owned common lands are easier to enclose because they are undefended. There are no agrarian elites to resist or oppose their enclosure. Now, why would agrarian elites during this negotiation between 2006 and 2008 want their fertile lands to be protected from SEZ enclosure? The setting up of an SEZ, particularly in a transitional context like India with regulatory flux, means that the SEZ project is fraught with risk. And in order to hedge their bets during an uncertain and precarious transition, these agrarian elites, who often own multiple and dispersed plots of fertile and waste land, chose to have their fertile land protected. If the SEZ project goes bust, they at least have their fertile lands to fall back on as a safety net, right? So this is a very, very strategic calculation by agrarian elites to safeguard their economic security during a precarious transition. Now, for these indigenous groups, on the other hand, these wastelands are the only assets that they own. And much to my surprise, when I started my fieldwork, I had expected these indigenous groups to be at the forefront of opposition to the enclosure of wasteland, right? But I found that not only were they not a part of the 2006 protests, but in fact, they eagerly welcomed the enclosure of their wasteland. And we can understand this. The reason for this is that the revaluation of their wasteland into a high value market asset is engendering a new politics of recognition amongst indigenous groups. As owners of a high demand market asset, many of these indigenous residents now refuse to work on the agricultural lands of the agrarian elites. Many of them have taken up urban informal jobs on the construction sites and in the factories coming up along the economic corridor. So what we see here is what Albert Hirschman would call exit politics, where marginalized groups are capitalizing on the revaluation of their wasteland to exit exploitative agrarian relations of caste and labor. But I have to emphasize here that these indigenous groups were not a part of the negotiations between 2006 and 2008, right? And these negotiations framed this public debate around the market language of shareholders as opposed to citizens and publics. And it's within this context that we have to understand the decisions made by these indigenous groups. So I'll end here. To reiterate the point, so in effect, this is a complex case, right? It reveals all of the complexities around enclosure when you look at it ground up. So I'll end here that the social cost across successive eras of development in India, right? Whether you're talking about colonial and post-colonial agricultural modernization programs, or whether you're talking about the new urban corridors, the social cost has been this land category of wasteland. And a persistent trend has been to strip land of its multiple meanings and to reduce it to its revenue and economic logics. And the big question for democratic India then is, what are the institutional arrangements that are needed to embed these land transformations, these new land transformations in the public sphere, right? So that indigenous groups, subaltern castes, non-propertied constituents who are not landowners have a voice in India's great transformation. So I'll end here. I look forward to Ben's comments and the conversation after. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sai. That was a fascinating talk. And I'm really, really curious now about what Ben has to say. So Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Anisha, Simone, Sedgwick, for inviting me as a discussant. The function of a discussant is to give everybody else the opportunity to think about good questions or comments. And I will gauge my success by the comments and questions that will ensue my contribution. And Sai, of course, I thank you for this very, very stimulating and provocative presentation. I find inspiration in the intriguing narrative that transcends the popular dichotomy of rural and urban. Sai, you convincingly tell us about agrarian elites who are key players in the conversion of rural wasteland into India's new economic corridors. The provocation I find in Sai's testing the limits of an economic concept, social cost. She says, and I quote from a paper I received from her earlier, and Sai already told you that we engaged in a lot of online discussions already. Quote, so for all this talk about India's grand experiment of new private cities, of financing these cities through private capital, there is a huge reliance and exploitation of public resources for the making of these cities, unquote. This contention emphasizes the unpaid contribution, the sacrifice even, of vulnerable and disadvantaged groups to the creation of India's new economic corridors. And I want to question whether that is a bit downplaying it to call that social cost, this complete upheaval and upsetting of the livelihood of marginalized vulnerable groups. But let's start with the inspiration. For more than 20 years, I have lived and worked in the Ruhr, Germany's former industrial heartland. Until the 19th century, the Ruhr was a vastly rural area with occasional urban centers, Duisburg, Essen, Dortmund. The city of Dortmund was part of the Hanse, a commercial network of trading posts all over Europe. Actually, that was the medieval age form of globalization. When coal was discovered in the Ruhr and new technologies of forging steel invented, the pastoral character quickly changed. Within a few decades, the booming steel industry resulted in rapidly growing cities and population. Vestiges of rural life still can be found in the Ruhr, a barnyard converted into a wine shop here, an ancient homestead presently used for high-end housing. Reading Sai Balakrishnan's excellent book, Shareholder Cities, I had to think about who benefited from the industrial conversion of the Ruhr. As far as I know, no employee ownership concept ever was attempted between Duisburg and Dortmund. There were no shareholders, just exploited laborers. The steel barons, the Thyssen family in Duisburg, the Krupp family in Essen, the Hösch family in Dortmund, each created a stronghold for themselves. They dominated their workers and showed little pity to rebel rousers who wanted to establish unions or ask for better salaries. Interestingly, the loyalty of these workers to their company still is proverbial in the Ruhr. The barons of the special economic zones in India seem to use different tactics. Instead of merely dispossessing the rural landowners, they turn them into stakeholders. I understand Sai's critique of stakeholder capitalism. I still think, however, it sounds nicer than the exploitation of the labor force in the Ruhr in the 19th and 20th century. There's also another parallel between Sai's account and the Ruhr. Several large farmers who sold their land to the steel companies became millionaires. Sometimes they continued to care for the land. Opposite the house I inhabited with my wife, there was a former barnyard converted into apartments. For the first 10 years, we watched an elderly gentleman pruning the hedges, removing weeds, watering flower beds. After a while, we learned that he was the former owner of the farm, who had sold his land for the development of the University of Dortmund. He was filthy rich, but he could not let go of taking care for the land. And after 10 years, when he passed his 90th birthday, he passed away. Now let's turn to the provocation. Social costs are disadvantages caused by a firm in the course of producing goods or rendering services, which the firm does not have to pay for. Social costs are incurred by a neighbor or the general public. Social cost, if considered from an economic point of view, still must be cost. It must be possible to express the cost in money. Without monetization, the so-called social cost cannot be considered properly as economically relevant input factor of a new economic corridor. Of course, these disadvantages will still be socially and politically important, but from a perspective of economics, it's difficult how to factor these costs into the overall picture of how does the regional economy fare. Herein lies the problem. In a situation of not only converting single plots of land into new uses, but of pressing the entire population of a whole region into a new lifestyle, putting money values on single items is virtually impossible. And this is when Sai's provocative presentation becomes very valuable. Combining land conversion, location theory, social cost, and property rights, Sai explains the downside of the Indian stakeholder cities as the social construction of redistributing wealth from the poor to the powerful. Concluding my comment, I would like to point out that this explanation reminded me to chapters 26 and following of volume 1 of Capital by Karl Marx. Marx criticized the accounts by John Locke, Adam Smith, and other property narratives as nursery tales. Such narratives would romanticize the previous or primitive accumulation of capital and the expropriation of land from rural people. With regard to the appropriation of land and other means of production, and I quote, "It is a notorious fact that conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, in short, force, play the greatest part. So-called primitive accumulation, therefore, is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production," unquote. Marx described the evolution of property relations as a constant rearrangement of exclusion that led up to the emergence of bourgeois property. I quote, "The spoliation of the church's property, the fraudulent alienation of the state domains, the theft of the common lands," Marx did not speak of wastelands, but obviously that's what he meant, "the usurpation of feudal and clan property and its transformation into modern private property under circumstances of ruthless terrorism, all these things were just so many idyllic methods of primitive accumulation. They conquered the field for capitalist agriculture, incorporated the soil into capital, and created for the urban industries the necessary supplies of free and rightless proletarians," unquote. Marx described a stream of land policies that modified property relations in the interest of an elite. The elite, the oppressing class, and that might include certain individuals from the rural area. The oppressing class benefited from a design of property which allows the appropriation of the surplus value of land use, the land rent, and of capital. This requires the progressing exclusion of vast parts of the population from meaningful property relations. Marx understood very well why the enclosure of the commons and the clearing of estates were essential for providing factories with cheap labor. And that is one of the things that I would be very curious to learn more about, whether in these new economic corridors, the former rural population is actually hired as part of the labor force or just kept as pet stakeholders. I did not really understand that yet. Are the agents behind shareholder cities imitating what Marx condemned, or have they developed a better solution for property relations required in the move from agrarian to industrial land uses? I cannot respond to these questions, but I hope that I have fulfilled my role of discussant and give everybody the opportunity to think of good or better comments and questions. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ben. Definitely very stimulating, stimulating discussion. So yeah, I guess me and Anisha are now opening the question and answer section. We're gonna have like 15 minutes, and invite everyone to ask their questions and ideally mention their names and their affiliation, what they're doing, and then a short question. And if you have a camera, of course, we'll be happy to see you and meet you virtually like this.
So you can just unmute yourself and ask your question by giving a short introduction. Right, we have somebody to ask the question. Yes.
Andrew, go ahead.
Hi, thank you both, Sai, for the presentation and Ben for the discussion. I'm also not clear whether the change in status of the wasteland users or owners, it was a positive step for them economically. I think, Ben referred to that just at the end. I wasn't clear whether this had transformed their lives or whether it was a simple dispossession and a forcing to work in the factories. I don't know if you could say more about that.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. And Ben, thank you so much for such insightful comments. And I think I'll actually also partly respond to Ben's very, very provocative insights as I'm addressing Andrew's question. So I would say for these indigenous groups, it's Janus faced, right? On the one hand, the fact that the wastelands that they occupied is now transformed into a high demand market asset means that they can break agrarian relations of dependency. And that's extremely, extremely important in India's very, very caste-ridden agrarian society. But on the other hand, what was very, very interesting for me during research is there are two additional sources of livelihood that's now becoming very common amongst indigenous groups, but more broadly amongst former agricultural laborers. One is India has a social welfare program called the Right to Employment Guarantee Program, which guarantees rural workers 90 or 100 days of guaranteed work. And it's very interesting because the wages are set there by the state. And again, this goes to my point on social welfare architecture is crucial, right? Democratic India needs to be very seriously thinking about it. And many of these indigenous groups were actually negotiating with agrarian landowners, saying that they will not work on their fields, on their farms, unless they can match the wage rate set by the state. Now, the other very important form of livelihood is urban informal work, right? And of course, we should not romanticize urban informal work. It's unregulated work where the social obligation, there is no obligation either on the part of the state or employers to cover even basic benefits, right? And yet many of these indigenous groups are now turning to urban informal work as a way to break away from relations of dependency. And so my point here is, you know, India is seeing, and we saw this during the migrant crisis last year, this very perhaps peculiar category of the peasant worker, of urban informal workers who still remain peasants, who hold on to their subsistence plots of land in their villages, right? And this straddling of the agrarian urban divide is very, very important for them, because there are very, very little safety nets during a precarious transition. But let me just add one more point. When Ben spoke about the enclosure, I think it's, I mean, one of the really, really important points that we have to keep in mind here is India's new enclosures, the enclosure of the wastelands for these private cities, is taking place in a context where even the peasantry, even landless laborers have the power of the vote. Right? So it's taking place in a democratic context. And so the sequencing is different. There is a marketization, there is a commodification of the wasteland, but in the context where the peasantry can vote. And this, of course, is what makes this the sequencing of development is very important to keep in mind, because, you know, when we're thinking about enclosure, dispossession, even David Harvey's wonderful, wonderful work on accumulation by dispossession, these indigenous groups are not being evicted from their land, right? But the fact that they have no state protection when they're making this transition, the fact that they're relying on urban informal work, unregulated informal work as a way to bargain with agrarian elites. I mean, we need to think about dispossession in different ways rather than just the eviction from land, leading to the proletarianization of the labor force that Marx was talking about in the context of England. So I'll just stop here for now, but I'm sure we'll pick up on these really important themes during the course of the discussion.
We also have Barbara Harris with us, who had a question in the chat box. Could you unmute yourself and ask the question, Barbara?
Hi, I can unmute myself, but I'm in the middle of writing the question, and I really would like to finish writing it before I try and say it. Do you mind if I go on writing?
That's okay, you can complete the question.
We also have a raised hand by Tashendra. Go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am, for a very intriguing presentation. I was wondering about the cost of, what is the social cost when India like country is moving, we consider as a welfare nation, but now more towards a regulatory state. So in a new liberal setup, how do you see we can make a more inclusive, a policy, so that they can have their due. So, and in means of that, how a proletariat, the labor force has created by this encroachment of basically by the state, and the hegemony which continue or perpetuated by the state, and the and tribals, or basically indigenous people have continuously devastated by the policies of state in last 7 years or so. So how you see a policy in India play a role in inclusive development, or it's more about a kind of a tool which, you know, devoid them from their basic means of earning livelihood itself?
Yeah, thank you, Tejendra. I mean, maybe one way in which I would respond to this, because of course there are welfare economists who think about this, genres and others, with a lot more sophistication than I can. But coming out of my disciplinary lens as a planner, I would go back to this question of the agrarian-urban divide, right? So these categories of the city and the village are so deeply entrenched in the work that we do, including in the architecture of social welfare. And that's precisely, and we need to rethink these categories, right? Because the most vulnerable residents are actually straddling the agrarian-urban divide. So for instance, you look at India's social welfare architecture, including very, very important programs, like the right to food, right? So your ration card is linked to your place of residence, right? Manrega, Employment Guarantee Scheme, it's rural works. And many of these peasants, these vulnerable agrarian groups, also double up as urban informal workers, right? And that was the cause of this really brutal mass exodus that we saw last year during the COVID migrant crisis, right? That there is no place for them. There is no urban social safety net, right? And so they perforce have to go back to their villages because their safety net is in their villages. So even though these programs like the Right to Food, Manrega are extremely, extremely important, I think what the migrant crisis made very visible for us is we need to rethink these agrarian urban categories when you're thinking about social welfare in India.
All right, Barbara, are you ready to ask a question? Or you want us to like read it out? Okay, there she is, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, there's something wrong with my camera, which is why I prefer to be off record. I really enjoyed this presentation, Sai, and it's very nice to meet you. And in my notes while you spoke, I also, like Ben, put primitive accumulation. But I don't want to ask a question about primitive accumulation. I want to keep within the framework of social costs. And it seems to me what you've presented this afternoon to us is an analysis of the social relations and, if you like, the costs of dispossession and displacement. But I know from Shareholder Cities that you've collected a large amount of land prices from all over the region over quite a long period of time. And I just wondered whether you could, whether it's possible, because Ben just said it's impossible to do an economic valuation, but whether you could actually compare the costs of irrigated and non-irrigated land. By the way, is all non-irrigated land wasteland? Because in my part of India, in Tamil Nadu, there's dry land as well as wasteland, Purambok. So there are three big categories. But anyway, can you compare the costs of irrigated and non-irrigated land and see how they evolve and somehow analyze the rupee value or the shadow price of the gap per household? It may be impossible, but if it is, you've got the data. And the third aspect of social cost, which you allude to in Shareholder Cities, is the cost, if you like, or the implications of people's social identity on market prices. And there's a growing literature. I was analyzing a Swedish PhD just last week on economic values and the social values, which apparently can't be valued in prices, but the social values that are embedded in markets and market behavior. So I just also wondered whether your Shareholder City evidence base enables you to compare the difference in prices of a given category of land, like irrigated land or non-irrigated land, because it won't be totally socially exclusive, owned by people who have different social status. So that's a third concept of social cost, which you hint at, but I wonder whether you can develop.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barbara. And I've been following Barbara's work. Her work is particularly the kind of how deeply, deeply empirical and grounded it is a huge inspiration for many of us. So that's a really good question on how can I take the land price work forward. And it's something that I have to think about because I should do more with this data. So to give some context to Barbara's comment, I collected land prices of around 242 villages, urbanizing villages along the Mumbai-Pune Expressway. And I'm deeply, deeply grateful to Revenue Department bureaucrats who helped me with this because this data does not exist. And you have to go to individual villages, to the Taluk office to get this data. And to me, one of the most interesting and again, surprising insights from this research is that during the Green Revolution, the most economically valuable land was the fertile land, right? Which meant that the land which was proximate to irrigation canals was the most economically valuable. And these were the lands that were appropriated by agrarian elites, or rather you can see the co-constitution of both agrarian class as well as land ownership during this time. Now what happens with the urban turn is that location trumps fertility as the key metric of economic value, right? And to me, it was very, very interesting during the research that advantageously located wasteland, right, which was economically waste during the context of the Green Revolution. Now, if it is in a favorable location proximate to an economic corridor or to one of these logistics infrastructures, can actually fetch a higher market price. And there is a price, yes, which comes from the revenue records. Now fetches a higher market price than disadvantageously located fertile land, right? And there are social implications to this because you could have indigenous groups who are advantageously located close to an economic corridor whose land now fetches a higher market price than disadvantageously located fertile land owned by agrarian elites, right? And it's precisely this kind of churning of social hierarchies, of caste-based hierarchies that I'm interested in. But to Barbara's question on how I can take this forward, it's something that I have to think about. And I'll just quickly also respond to the question on social cost and economic value, right? Because of course, what it's like I said, it's jazz-faced, right? Because on the one hand, these indigenous groups have a new politics of recognition, and it's just so important. When I was doing my field work, there were younger generation men in their 20s and 30s who were wearing jeans. They were going to work in the factory, again, as urban informal work. But all of this constitutes a new politics of recognition, right? Where you're not, where they're becoming more assertive, and it's extremely, extremely important. But at the same time, they've given up their only asset, their land, for a share in an SEZ company, right? So land ownership, as Catherine Verdery brilliantly shows in her book, The Vanishing Hectare, is not only about claims to land, but it is also about the debt and liability that comes with that land, right? So they've now become, there are huge liabilities if this SEZ does not work, right? And it's precisely these very, very complex subjectivities that I was trying to look at in the CADE SEZ case.
So thank you very much for the answer, Sai. Now I would like to give the floor to Diana. open your mic and you can pose your question.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you for your presentation. It was very clear and very interesting. I have two questions. So the first one is it always the case that people who live in wastelands legally own the land or not? And my second question is, I'm sure that throughout your research, of course, you want to be as descriptive and accurate as possible, but I'm sure that you also in the back of your mind are thinking about solutions. So my question is, what could be done to balance more the power between both parties? Because I think that's one of your main questions. It's okay that they have a share, but is it balanced, and actually do they have a choice? And or is it a matter of is better than nothing? So that's my question. A possible solution or a couple of things that occur to you that could balance it a little bit more. And do they always own the land legally or not? Because if not, then they have no negotiation power, I would say. So that's my question. Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. And no, they don't always own the land, right? So it's very important to remember that the region that I'm working in has a relatively lower incidence of landless laborers than other parts of the country, right? So that's a crucial point to remember. And there are many wastelands, quote unquote wastelands, that are government owned, right? So Barbara mentioned the Poramboka land, and there's actually some wonderful research that that's being done by Nityanand Jayaraman. It's a song by a very famous Indian classical musician called T.M. Krishna, where they are trying to decolonize these colonial era land categories of waste. So if anyone is interested, you should listen to their song Poramboka, which is about reclaiming these lands that were categorized as waste by the colonial state. But to your point, no, there's a rich diversity in agrarian political economies across regions in India. Right, so we have to be very careful when we think about how we're going to generalize from regional case studies onto national policy. And in fact, in my book, one of the main policy-oriented suggestions that I have is, even though we have the 2013 amended Land Acquisition Act, which has some very important democratic clauses in it, thanks to public-spirited bureaucrats like Harsh Mandar, Aruna Roy, and others. A national level land policy is not able to capture regional caste and class structures, right? And so that would be my main suggestion, that we actually have to think regionally. And again, Barbara has done an immense amount of work in this regard.
All right, we have Emma. Emma, would you like to go next and ask your question?
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for a fabulous talk. I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. I had a very quick question, and it might not be a quick answer. It was if you could say a little bit more about the impact on gender, and particularly obviously women, in the sort of transference of land in this way, although it's not a direct dispossession. Was that something, a significant finding you came across?
Exactly. No, that's such an important point. And I think that goes to, so in the KREZ, for instance, not all wasteland is privately owned, right? Indigenous groups don't always have titles to their land. So it was so in this case. Now, in the KREZ region and in the regions where they do have private property rights, the title to the land more often than not vests with the male head of household, right? Which is generally the younger generation male. And so when I glossed over it and said that the Adivasis, the indigenous groups, eagerly welcomed the enclosure of their wasteland, that's not true, right? It was the younger generation men, right, who hold the title to the land, who were enthusiastic supporters of the enclosure of their wasteland. And in fact, most of the women that I spoke to vehemently opposed the enclosure of these lands, right? And one of the reasons was that these wastelands, see, earlier they could rely on their own wasteland, right? The wasteland that the men had the titles to. They could also rely on the government-owned wasteland, and they could also rely on the wasteland owned by the agrarian elites to graze livestock, right? So many of them had goats, and they used to depend on these goats for milk for their children. And now with the enclosure of all of these wastelands, they've had to sell off their livestock. Many of them have had to sell off their livestock. And many of the women said that they are now dependent on the market to purchase milk for their children, right? So this is, in a sense, primitive accumulation, right? Where you don't have a control over your means of production, where you are now dependent on an inflationary and commoditized food market to get an essential resource like milk for your children. And I think this is where, this category of the waste and the work, the decolonizing work around these land categories is important, because the quote unquote wasteland is the commons, right? So that's what these women were doing. They were engaged in commoning activities, right? And the commons is the antithesis to the commodity, right? So yes, so a lot of these intra-household inequalities, right, around gender, around age, got sharply exacerbated with the enclosure of these wastelands.
Okay, thank you very much. Great question. We have, I think, time for 2 questions, but let's keep it short because we're a little bit over time already. So first, I would like to ask Farwa, do you want to pose your question or questions?
Farwa has requested the moderator to read the question. I think she said she has a problem with her speaker.
Okay.
Yeah. So she has a bit of a context to her question. It says that I read in a book that in a meeting by the Ministry of Rural Areas and Employment in 1999, MC Saxena, the then secretary to the Planning Commission, stated that he estimated that there have been about 50 million people displaced by the development projects since independence till then. And then she said that she looked up the rehabilitation policy, and as per the Land Acquisition Act of the 1984, there was only a cash compensation for the displaced people. The Land Acquisition Act of 2013 promises resettlement and rehabilitation to displaced people. So do we have any study on how effective the current resettlement policy and processes are?
Yeah, thank you, Farwa. So I would actually point you here to the excellent work by Namita Wahi at the Center for Policy Research. Her her land unit has been tracking Supreme Court cases. They've been she's a lawyer, and they've been very closely tracking these new clauses of the 2013 Land Acquisition Act, right? So I would point you in the direction of Namita Wahi's fabulous work here. The one thing that I would say is the 2013 Land Acquisition Act is very important, right? So it has a clause, for instance, so yes, it talks about resettlement and rehabilitation. And of course, these laws, right, progressive laws are important because they're an aspirational ideal. And it's really important that the Indian state has recognized that resettlement and rehabilitation is crucial, right? Just cash compensation is not enough. There's another very important clause to the 2013 LARA, and that's the social impact assessment, right? That villagers, any large-scale land acquisition, needs the consent of the village deliberative body, right? And it has to be a social impact assessment, which is not just about the economic value of the land, but really the social benefits of the land, right? So these are very important clauses that have actually made their way into the 2013 LARA through democratic struggle, right? So I would just I would just highlight that when you actually read this 2013 LARA, it's almost a schizophrenic piece of legislation, right? It has like this hyper-marketization on the one hand, but it does have some very, very important democratic clauses on the other.
Thank you very much. So I think last question for today will be posed by Himanshu. If you're here and your electronics work, feel free to pose it personally.
Thank you, Professor Balakrishnan, for that illuminating talk. Several of India's most industrially advanced states, mainly Andhra Pradesh and Haryana, but Maharashtra also tried to do it. I'm not sure of the legal status. They recently tried to pass laws in which they would reserve or mandate quotas for, local residents, nativist quotas for even private sector jobs. Now, the Khed SEZ now hosts production facilities of several large domestic and multinational corporations with overall higher earnings and medium to high skill jobs, which would be out of reach otherwise. In this context, how do you see these efforts to pass these nativist laws? How do you interpret them?
Yeah, and no, that's a really good question, Himanshu. And we have to remember that most of these residents in the Khed area, and I did a survey of their educational levels as part of this Khed SEZ study. Particularly for the indigenous groups, many of them are 8th standard high school pass, right? So they're not going to enter the formal economy, right? They're going to be employed in the urban they're going to be employed in urban informal jobs in these factories and construction sites. So that's one, right? Because many of these are regulations around formal work, formal employment. There was another point that I wanted to mention and it slipped my mind.
Okay, thank you very much. I think now I want to give the floor.
But when I remember, I'm going to email you. I'll get your email from Satvik and I'll email you, Himanshu. There was another important. This was the point. So and many of the, when you actually talk to like I spoke to both Bharat Forge HR, but also to the contractors, right? Many of these factories do not want to employ informal workers from the local area, right? Because of the threat of unionization. And that's the whole point of the informal economy, right? To get away from labor protection and unionization. So many of these urban informal workers, in fact, are coming from, they're very, very reluctant, these factories, to hire local informal workers. And of course, there are contractors, labor contractors who are bringing workers from various other parts of the country.
Great. So I think what we can do now is we can, I can give the floor for an formal conclusion to Satvik, and then we can stop the recording. And if you would like, we can continue a little bit the discussion since it's going on so lively. So Satvik, go ahead.
So this is the most easiest job. I would like to thank Dr. Sai Balakrishnan and Professor Benjamin Davy for this wonderful session. And thank you all the participants for your questions. I'm sure you have many more and maybe you can write to them. And I have seen in most of the occasions, scholars like to argue over emails, debate, learn, go learn. So please go ahead and write to them. And this is a part of a longer project, like Anisha has indicated before. There will be another session on the 1st of July by Chinmay Tumban. He's an assistant professor at the Indian Institute of Management, and I would say arguably one of the one of the known young scholar from India, based in India, who has worked a lot on pandemic, and he will be talking about what happened in India during the last pandemic in 1920. So if you have time and interest, please join us. And thank you once more to Simone and Anisha, Sai, Ben, everyone, and wish you a great evening from here. Yeah, thanks.
Join us for an informal session. We can stop the recording now.
Yeah, please do it.